Today we're going to be working on a 2000 Dodge Ram 3500 Cummins with a 5.9 liter diesel in it. Now we're going to be replacing the high pressure fuel injection pump. We have a replacement unit here. We're going to go through a couple things that you should know and that you should keep in mind when you're going through this replacement process, just so that it's done right the first time and you don't run into any issues after the fact. So we'll get her opened up here. And what we're going to find in our kit is going to be, one, an instructions sheet that's going to help you get some of those important notes that you're going to have, things like torque specifications and, process of removal, process of reinstallation. But also in this kit, there is a fuel swab test kit. And the nice thing about that test kit, you can take that swab, dip it into some of the fuel that's already in the system, and then that's going to give you an indication of whether or not there are some of the more common contaminants in the system, things like rust, water, algae, those types of contaminants. If you find after using the test swab that there are contaminants, make sure you clean and flush that fuel system before you put the replacement unit on. Because if there is debris or any type of contamination in the system before you replace the unit, that contamination is going to make its way to the new unit, and it's just going to have you going back through the entire process all over again if that contamination ends up causing damage to the new unit. So with that said, let's get the unit out and go over a couple of things that are important to note. Now with our replacement unit out of the box and visible, we're going to go over a few things that, again, are very important to keep in mind when replacing this pump, and things that you want to look out for, as well as make sure you do in the process of installing the pump. Now, to start with, one of the most important things is going to be the keyway that is actually on the shaft. Now, I'll tilt it so you can see that there's a lip here, and that's actually the keyway that is inserted into the shaft right here on the pump. It's very important that this keyway not be damaged or missing during the installation of the process. If that keyway is damaged or missing, the likelihood of you having an issue is almost guaranteed. It's going to have an issue with priming, pumping, and overall doing the job that the pump is supposed to do. So one thing that you want to do before you remove the old unit is, as you're removing it, make sure that this keyway is in the position you see it in on this pump now, which is the 12 o'clock position. You want to see this keyway in the 12 o'clock position on the pump that you're pulling out. That gives you an indication that when you go back to put the new pump in, that you're going to have that keyway lined up correctly, because this keyway does have to be lined up to the gear pretty much perfectly in order to get the pump to slide in freely and not damage this keyway. One of the most common problems with these pumps when being replaced is damage to this keyway. So something to keep in mind and be very cautious of as you're going through the process. And one last thing to make note of when it comes to this keyway is this keyway is specific to this pump. So your old unit will have a keyway on it, and if you were to order 4 to 5 of these pumps, they would all have a different keyway that are specific to that pump. So it's very important that you don't lose this keyway or damage it, and if you do, make sure you don't use this pump. It needs to be replaced with a different pump. In 99.9% of the cases, you cannot reuse another key for this pump. So imagine that your old pump comes out, the pump has failed, but the key is still in good condition. You can't use the key from that old pump on the replacement pump. It has to be this key. So keep that in mind. One other thing, prior to putting the new pump in, we talked about using that fuel test swab to check for contaminants. That's a great way to keep from letting contaminated fuel get to the pump, but it's also good to just visually inspect the fuel as well. Make sure you don't see any things floating around inside, any algae that are building up. There's multiple places where you can have contamination in the system, whether it be in the fuel filter, whether it be in the fuel tank, whether it be in the fuel lines. It's good to check multiple sources for fuel contamination prior to putting in a new pump. Because again, these pumps are very sensitive, just like the injectors on this vehicle, and any type of contamination or debris can do a lot of harm and in a very fast manner. Now, continuing on with the conversation about contamination or debris, another great way to check for that is on your old unit. Now, this is our replacement unit, but I'm going to show you on this unit since it's easier to see, it's off the vehicle. Make sure when you pull your old unit out of the vehicle, take the spindle, the shaft here, and just rotate it. You should be able to easily spin this around freely and not feel any resistance whatsoever. If, however, you pull your unit out, the replacement that you're going to be getting rid of, and you feel any type of grinding, any thick resistance, or you hear any type of noises that would lead you to believe that there's some type of debris or contamination in there, that's a guaranteed indicator that you have something in that fuel system that needs to be cleaned out prior to putting this pump in. Because you have to think of it this way: if it's causing binding on the old unit, it's going to eventually cause binding on the new unit, and in most cases it will immediately cause binding on the new unit, and we don't want that. That's a whole lot of work that you shouldn't have to do 2 or 3 times. We can get this done right the first time, keep that fuel contamination down, and get that truck back up and running a lot faster if we check for these small little things before getting in the process of actually putting the new pump in. So again, make sure you can rotate that shaft freely and not feel any resistance, any grit, or hear any noises that would indicate there's anything in there causing binding for that shaft. Now, coming back to the topic of the actual installation of the replacement pump, you're going to be supplied with all new seals, O-rings, and overflow valve. We want to make sure that we use everything in this kit during the installation process. It's there for a reason, and we want to make sure that if we take it off, we put it back on with the new unit. This should not be left to the side. They need to be used in every installation. And then a couple of final notes on this pump prior to installing it and removing that old pump. We want to make sure while we're working on removing the old pump and this pump is waiting on the side, we keep all of our connections covered with these caps that are supplied. We don't want to take the risk of any foreign debris or anything that we can't even see with the naked eye that's floating around in our space here that goes inside of any of these lines. These lines are going to supply that fuel to the rail, and any debris that gets in here is going to make its way to the rail, which will then of course make its way to the injector, and we don't want that happening. So while we're in the process of removing the old pump, and even when you're in the process of installing this pump, until it comes to the point where you need to install the lines, keep these caps on. And one last thing to point out when it comes to this pump and in the installation process is this. When we look at the top of the pump on the module, we have a 2-wire harness going into the module with a black sheath on it here. We want to make sure that's all we have. So imagine that you pull your old unit out and you find that this wiring harness has other wires spliced into it. That's not a good thing. That means that at some point this pump has been tuned to either deliver more fuel, more power, whatever the case is, but it has had a tune on it, and that's why those wires are spliced in. So if you were to take your old pump off that has been spliced and has been tuned and then replace it with a factory setting pump, you may think you're experiencing a loss of power when in reality the truck's just running like it was originally meant to. So if you do find that you have an old unit that you're pulling off that has been tuned and spliced into on the wiring harness, make sure you either detune it if you have that capability, or go to a shop that has the capability and make sure they can verify that it either has already been detuned or it can be detuned before putting this pump in. If not, again, you may think you're losing power when in reality the truck is running just like it should be. To that note, we should also point out, anytime you replace a pump with a factory setting pump, you should not splice into this wiring harness and try to tune it. These pumps are not meant to put any more higher output than what was originally manufactured for it. So while it may maintain a certain amount of tune for a period of time, eventually tuning a pump like this that is geared strictly for factory use will cause it to fail prematurely. And that's why we don't want to find any spliced wires in here. And generally speaking, that also voids the warranty once you've spliced into this wiring system. So keep that in mind, something to look for on your pump when you're pulling it out. If you see that, be mindful of it, and just know that if you put this pump back in, you're going to have a difference in power versus what has been done to the original pump when it's been tuned. So now that we've gone over the pump itself, we're here at the truck, and we want to go over a few things that you're going to have to remove to make sure you can access that pump. Now, we have quite a few connections that are going to have to be removed, but the first one we're going to start with are going to be the batteries. You can see we've already done that here. We've disconnected and removed the driver's side battery. We've also disconnected the passenger side battery, left the battery in its spot, but we do have it disconnected. Now, the next steps are going to be having to remove a few electrical connections at the pump itself, along with some fuel lines. And we could technically access those now, but it will be a lot easier if we have a few more things out of our way. So what we're going to do first is we're going to access this bolt here, and we're going to move our engine oil dipstick tube up and out of the way. We're going to disconnect our horn and our downpipe. We're going to get those out of the way, and then we're going to disconnect our crankcase ventilation hose and breather cap here from the timing cover and get those out of the way. Now, one other thing that we've done that you can see, and it's not mandatory, but it is something that we did that's going to give us a lot more room and visualization here and access, is we removed that upper radiator hose as well as the fan and fan shroud. Now, this is not something that's required. You don't have to do this, but if you have the tools available to you to get these items off and get them out of the way, it's going to make this job a lot easier for you in the long run. So that's just something we recommend for ease of access, but it is not required to get the job done. So we'll go ahead and get our engine oil dipstick tube out of the way. We'll get our other components that we addressed out of the way, and then we'll go on to the next step. Okay, so now that we have our downpipe out of the way, our horn out of the way, we have our crankcase hose out of the way, along with the breather cap out of the way, we're getting really close to seeing and gaining access to this pump. Now, one thing, once we took that horn off, it automatically broke our heater away and free, which is great. We don't have to disconnect any more of this. We can set this to the side, throw it over the brake booster or the brake reservoir and get it out of our way. And now we have 3 bolts holding the housing on that's housing our APP, our accelerator pedal position sensor. Now, we could take just the APP off itself, but we're still going to have a large chunk of this bracket over the top of our pump. We're just going to go ahead and take the whole thing though and give ourselves as much room and access to that pump as we possibly can. So that's going to be our next steps. We're going to get this out of the way. We're going to remove our 3 bolts here. We're going to swing this out of the way, and then we're going to get the camera in a little bit closer and show you just how accessible this pump is once you've done this little bit of removal in this installation and removal process. And now that we have these items out of the way, you're going to see we have a large opening here that we need to cover and make sure no debris gets in. So you can just take a nice clean shop rag, put that down inside of that opening. Let's make sure we don't get any debris or contamination down in there. And then we're also going to disconnect the power to our APP, which we don't have power going to it now because we have disconnected the batteries, but removing this pigtail is going to give us a little bit more access to move this out of the way and get us access to our pump. And now you can see we have our fuel lines visible, we have our pump visible, and just in front here on our gear cover, we have our bolt visible that's holding that pump in from the front. So now we can start looking at the next steps in the process that we're going to need to do to get the actual pump free from the housing itself. And for that, we're going to have to come to this side of the pump and show you some of those connections. So now that we have access to our pump, we've got our APP out of the way, we've got our heater out of the way, we have our port plugged in with a clean shop rag, we can now go ahead and disconnect the electrical connector to the pump itself. And to do that, we're just going to grab this tab and we're going to pull back on it. And as we pull back, it will separate the connector from the pump. And just like that, we have our connection to the pump out of the way. And now we can start focusing on our fuel lines. We have our delivery lines coming to the pump. We have our overflow valve on the side of that. And then we also have another line for fuel to the pump down here on the bottom of the side. So we'll take care of these lines first, and then we'll start working on those lines in the very back. Okay, so now with everything out of the way that we've removed and kind of pushed to the side or taken off, and then with our electrical connections disconnected, one of the things we want to do before we go any further in this process is get ourselves a little bit more cleaned up in here. Now, when we're dealing with a high pressure fuel system like this, any amount of debris is too much debris. So even down to a grain of sand can be enough debris to get into the system and destroy the injectors or the pump itself. Now, we're not going to be able to get it perfect, but let's mitigate as many opportunities as we can for debris to get in. So now that we have our port filled here with a rag, we're going to take some carb cleaner and we're going to spray all of our fuel lines that are connected to the pump, and anything that's going to be opened up here in a moment, like the back of the pump where the fuel lines meet, where all this dirt and debris and dust has just built up over the years. Now again, we're not going to be able to get all of it, but we're going to get as much as we possibly can so that we can mitigate as many opportunities for debris to get into that system as possible. We'll do that, and then we're going to start working on getting these lines off so that we can access the back of the pump. Now that we've got our lines cleaned, sprayed off, and just made sure we got as much of that dust and dirt out of the way as we possibly can, we're now going to have to start breaking these lines free. Now as you run down the plate, you're going to find multiple connections for the entire line assembly. What you need to do, and I'm going to zoom out here in a moment and show you where the other connections are, is disconnect the bolts holding the line assemblies to the plate, and then we need to disconnect the lines at each cylinder so we can break that tension that's holding those lines so tight. Now you're going to run into a quick problem here, which is in the very back we have a bracket that's in the way, and you can see that bracket here. This bracket is only held on by two 15mm bolts, so it's actually very easy to remove. And once you get that bracket out of the way, you can access that last final cylinder and break that line free so you can move those lines and get them out of the way. Because where these lines lead is to the back of the injection pump. And once you break them free from the back of the injection pump, it's still very tight because of where they're connected at the top of the motor. So we got to get all these connections broken loose so that we can get these lines out of the way and freely access that pump and pull it out of the housing without causing any damage. Now that we've zoomed out just a little bit, I'll give you a better view of what I'm talking about when I say breaking these lines free. Again, there's 6 lines that are going to be connected to the back of the pump itself, and they all correspond to this kind of spaghetti network of lines that's going up to this plate. So we have a connection in the front right here that's holding some of the line together. We have 2 in the middle, and then right before that bracket that you're taking off, we have another 2 bolts that are going to hold these assemblies in place, along with each of these bolts that's feeding the line to the head itself. And that's why we're going to remove that bracket. Once that bracket's out of the way, we can break free that final injector line in the back of the head, and then having done that and broken these bolts free that are holding the entire assembly on, we'll have this a little bit more free so that when we go to the back of the pump and release those lines, we should be able to move this entire assembly out of the way and give us a lot more room to pull the pump directly out. So now that we have that bracket removed in the back that we discussed earlier, and we have all of our lines free, you'll notice half of the assembly of the lines are out of the way already. And the reason we pulled those is to show you that in all reality, there's really only a few connections that you're going to have to take care of to get each line assembly out. Now before I show you what those are, let me show you these little glove fingers that we've cut off of a rubber glove. The reason we're doing this, and we're going to do it on the other side of the line assembly as well, is we want to cover the ends of the lines when we set this to the side, because we don't want any debris that might be floating around to get inside of those lines and then back into the injector when we reinstall it. So when we removed the bracket nuts that were in the front of the plate here, the 2 that were in the middle, and the 2 that were in the rear, what it did was it basically freed up the line from the plate. Then when we removed the nuts that were going into the head itself, it removed the bracket from that part of where it's locked in. So the only thing holding this bracket in place now are the 3 bolts on the back of the pump. And that's why we're pulling it off this way. There's really only a few connections that you have to remove to get these entire line assemblies off. They come off in 2 pieces, 3 lines each. And the reason we want to do it this way is very simple. It's very easy to cause damage to these lines if what we try to do is push them out of the way or move them out of the way with all of the forces that are on them. You have to look at it this way. You have a connection here, you have connections here, and you have connections here. If all you do is remove this connection in the back of the pump and try to move those lines out of the way, it's very likely you're either going to crimp the line or possibly even crack the line, and you may not see the crack. It may be a hairline crack that until you put it all back together and then build pressure back up, you won't notice until it's leaking. Because you have to understand there are thousands and thousands of PSI worth of pressure running through these lines. A hairline crack is all it takes to basically destroy all the work that you've done to put this thing together. So instead of having to come back and do it twice, let's get it done right the first time. Let's put in a little bit more work, a little bit more effort. Let's disconnect all of our lines at the pump, at the head, and at the plate, all those bolts, and then we can just pull those lines out freely and get them all completely out of the way so that that pump can just come straight out. And once we get this one off, we only have a few more lines on the side of the pump. Then we'll come to the front and show you how to get that nut removed and break that pump away from the housing. And we're almost done with this job. We've only got a few more steps to make, and we'll have this pump replaced and get this truck back up and running. We now have all of our lines disconnected from the high pressure fuel pump, both on the lines that go to the head and to the injectors and the lines that actually supply the fuel to the high pressure fuel pump. So we're now back at the front of the motor. You can see here we're looking at the front of the gear cover, and we're looking at the bolt that's actually holding the pump in place from the front side. We still have some bolts on the back of the pump that are going to have to be removed, but on the front we want to address this first. You see where it says TDC, top dead center, and we have basically a hash mark going straight down to 12 o'clock position. If you'll remember, in the beginning of the video I referenced that keyway on the shaft being at the 12 o'clock position. This is what we're talking about. So what we've done is we've actually rotated the motor, or turned the crank, until we could tell that the keyway on the old pump is in the 12 o'clock position. And again, we'll show an image of what that looks like so you can get a better idea of what we're talking about. But we have to make absolutely sure that that is in the 12 o'clock position and lined up with this hash mark before we ever remove the nut, the washer, and go any further in the steps. And the reason for that is pretty simple. Underneath the shaft here, there's a very large gap where I'm running my finger now. If that keyway is not at the 12 o'clock position and you go to remove this nut and washer and then the pump, it could shear that keyway, and that keyway could drop down into the housing, which is going to cause you a lot more work and frustration than you're probably going to want to deal with. So getting that in the 12 o'clock position is going to make sure that we don't run into those kind of issues. At the same time, as we remove this nut, the washer behind it is just as susceptible to falling down into that gap as the nut or the keyway. So what we're going to do is we're going to remove the nut. We're going to keep our finger in the back and just kind of make sure that that washer does not move. And once the nut is removed, we're going to use an extendable magnet to grab that washer and pull it out, maintaining everything that we need to maintain to make sure that everything is secure and does not fall down into this gap. So we'll do that now, and then we'll go on to the next steps where we're going to remove the bolts from the back of the pump. And so now with our keyway in the 12 o'clock position and our retaining nut and our washer removed, we're now going to use this is a standard or a universal gear puller. We're going to get this lined up with the actual mounting plate of the gear inside here. We're going to go ahead and lock in the bar, and we used a cone style on the end so we don't damage that core. And what we're going to do now is, before we remove the bolts that are holding the pump on from the back side, we're actually going to start slowly rotating this gear puller so we can break free the gear from the pump. We want to do this before we start pulling those bolts out of the back so that it can break freely whenever we do so. Now, one thing I will mention, you do not want to use an impact tool on this or any type of power tool on this. This is something you want to do slowly and be very careful about. If you do it with an impact gun or any type of air compressed tools, you could cause a lot of damage, and we don't want to have that happen because that's going to give you a lot more work that's going to have to be done before you can get this job complete. Now that we have the pump broken free from the gear housing using the gear puller, we need to come back to the back side of the pump now, and it's a little bit harder to see down here, so we went ahead and pulled some of the threads out. But as you can see, at the very bottom underneath the pump itself, we have 2 bolts that are going to hold onto a bracket that is actually one of the last pieces that we have to remove before we can get this pump out. We're going to remove this bolt and this bolt here, and that's going to secure that pump bracket, the housing bracket. And then we've got 4 bolts at the front of the pump itself holding it onto the back side of the housing. And with those 4 bolts removed and the 2 bolts removed from the pump bracket, we'll be able to slip this pump straight out. And that's why we removed all this stuff that we removed, especially the lines, because it's going to make it so much easier to take that pump and go straight back with it. So now with the bracket bolts removed and the 4 bolts holding the pump onto the housing, we were able to pull that pump straight out and get it out of our way. But I want to make one important note here. You'll notice we kept the gear puller on the gear. It's very important that you do this. And the reason for that is, by leaving this in this position, we still have the gear in the 12 o'clock position, and the notch for the keyway is still in the 12 o'clock position, matching up to our hash on the front of the cover here. We want to keep it this way because when we put the new pump back in, we need to make absolutely sure that that keyway matches the 12 o'clock position here. So by keeping this here, one, we don't take any risk of the gear moving around and causing damage. We also make it very much a lot easier for us to put the pump back in at the 12 o'clock position, which again is one of the most important aspects of replacing this pump. If that keyway is not in the 12 o'clock position, once reinstalled, it could cause a lot of problems, or the truck may not run at all. So as you can see, we have the old pump removed. We have it sitting side by side with the replacement pump. And obviously now what we're going to have to do is remove this bracket that's holding the pump in place. So we have two T50 bolts that are here that are going to have to be removed. Pretty simple process. We'll just take these out of here, move the bracket over to this side, and that'll make it very easy to reinstall this pump. One thing I do want to mention though, if you look, the old O-ring or seal that's around the pump itself where it goes into the housing, we are not going to reuse that. This pump is going to come with a new O-ring or seal, and we're going to get that in place before we put this pump in and make sure that we replace that and not use anything old on it. Also, once we get the pump installed, it'll be a good time to remove our caps here for our 3 lines that go into the side of the pump, and then again we'll then be able to remove those caps that we kept on for the fuel lines themselves. One final note, in the beginning of the video I told you about making sure that this keyway was clocked in the 12 o'clock position. Now if we look at the old pump, it's really in a way in the 11 o'clock position here. The reason for that is, if we go back to where the gear puller is now and where that gear housing is, we're looking for the 12 o'clock position to match up to the gear at the top dead center hash on the front of the cover. So what we need to do before we put this pump in, we need to line our key up to that 12 o'clock position. So as you can see, this pump, it's closer to the 11 o'clock position. We'll go ahead and get it close to where that is, on where this pump is. But as we guide this pump in, we're going to watch and make sure that this key doesn't meet any resistance whatsoever going through. The groove for this keyway to fit in is perfectly sized for it. And as long as we don't force it, it should slide straight in. We just may have to adjust our shaft a little bit to make sure that that keyway lines up. Again, this is a very important step to this installation process. Any damage to this key is going to cause a lot of timing issues and just overall issues with the vehicle running correctly at all. We now have our replacement pump reinstalled, just going back in reverse order of how we took the old one off, but again remembering to make sure that that keyway was lined up at the 12 o'clock position. We've gotten all of our components for the most part back where they belong, but there are a lot of torque settings that we need to be mindful of and some things that are going to be required while you put this back together. So rather than show you each and every single one of them, you'll understand what I'm saying as I'm telling you which ones go where. When we look at the back of the pump from the back side of the housing, the 4 bolts that you took off that held that pump to the front of the housing or the back side of the front of the housing, those are going to be torqued down to 32 foot-pounds. When you start reinstalling your lines on the side of the pump, those are going to be torqued down to 18 foot-pounds. Then when you get to the lines that are on the back of the pump, the actual fuel lines that are leading up to the head itself and that spider web of lines, those are also going to be 18 foot-pounds. It gets a little different though once we get up top and at the head. Once we get everything completely put back together and we go to start this truck, we're first going to have to do a bleed procedure, get the air out of the lines and things like that. So what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to go ahead and torque down the 2nd, 5th, and 6th line to the head. The 2nd, 5th, and 6th, we're going to torque down to 28 foot-pounds, but we're not going to torque down cylinder 1, 3, or 4 just yet. We're going to leave those cracked open for the bleed procedure. And it's kind of fortunate that that's the ones they've chosen, because once we get everything back together and we get that bleed procedure done, oddly enough, cylinder 1, 3, and 4 are really the only ones we can access still to get torqued down. So we'll follow that procedure. Additionally, before we do the 4 bolts on the back of the pump itself, we're going to do a preliminary torque setting of anywhere between 15 and 22 foot-pounds on the front bolt. It's just a preliminary torque. We're going to set it just a little bit. Then we're going to do those 4 in the back to that 32 foot-pounds. And once everything else is done, prior to doing the bleed procedure, we're going to torque this main nut down to 125 foot-pounds. It's imperative that we get all of these torque settings taken care of to make sure that this system runs properly when we get everything back together and this truck is up and running. We have our 5.9 liter Cummins put back together now after doing our fuel pump replacement. We've got everything back in line. We've got our fan shroud back on. We have our radiator fan back on. We also have all of our lines reconnected and torqued down to the proper specifications, and all of our electrical connections reestablished. Now, one thing I did mention in the last part of the video was doing the air bleed procedure. This is very vital when it comes to getting this truck to start properly the first time. If it's not done, you're just going to sit there and hear the truck cranking over and over and over until the batteries eventually die, and that's not good. It's going to lead you to believe that there's something wrong with either the injectors or the pump or something in the fuel system itself. So here's the actual bleed procedure that you need to follow prior to actually starting to pump up the first time and the truck up the first time. On the side of the pump, where you have your fuel inlet, where the fuel is actually being delivered to the pump on the side, you need to crack that line just a little bit. You also need to keep the number 1 cylinder, the number 3 cylinder, and the number 4 cylinder loose. You don't want to torque down that line just yet. Number 2, 5, and 6, you can go ahead and torque those down to 28 foot-pounds, but number 1, 3, and 4, leave those loose. Then what you want to do is you want to get in the vehicle. You want to go ahead and bump the key. You don't want to try to start it just yet. You want to bump the key, and that's going to prime the low pressure fuel pump for 25 seconds. That's going to bring a little bit of fuel delivery up to the high pressure fuel pump. Once you've done that a couple of times, then you can try and start to crank the truck. Now, you only want to do this for no more than 30-second intervals. Really, 20 to 30 is going to be just fine. 20 to 30-second intervals, and this is where it's going to be really handy to have a friend, someone that can help you out and put an eye on these lines and on the side of the pump. Because the air bleed procedure, as you're cranking it over, eventually that air is going to push fuel out of the line on the side of the pump and out of the lines on the top of the head. So again, at 1, 3, and 4, you should see fuel bubbling out, and you should see fuel bubbling out at the side of the pump. Once you see that happen, you can go ahead and crank down on those lines. Make sure you torque these to 28, and make sure you torque that one back on the side of the pump to 18 foot-pounds. Then the truck should start up just fine. Now, if you see that procedure happen where you have the bubbling of the fuel coming out on all 3 of these lines and on the side of the pump, and then you try to start the truck after putting the lines back down tighter and it doesn't start, do the air bleed procedure a second time. It can take up to 2 times to get this procedure done, but it is important that you go through this procedure. If you don't, again, the truck is most likely not going to start, which is going to have you going all the way back through this process and trying to diagnose a problem that doesn't exist. So make sure you do the air bleed procedure. We've already done that on this truck. Now we're going to start it up, and we're going to get it on the road and see how it drives. And hopefully now you have a better understanding of how to replace the high pressure fuel pump on this 2000 5.9 liter Cummins engine.